Hello, everybody, and welcome to this BENEDMO webinar. My name is Michael Hameleers, and I'll be your host for today. We are going to talk about ways to make fact checks work, and I do this together with Michael Hameleers, Marina Tulin, and Luc van Bakel, who I will now shortly introduce. Marina Tulin is a researcher at the University of Amsterdam. Her research interests include disinformation and public trust in knowledge institutions like science and journalism. Michael Hameleers is also a researcher at the University of Amsterdam who specializes in disinformation and its effects and the use of new technologies in the dissemination of deceptive information. And Luc van Bakel is a journalist who leads the fact-checking team at VRT. In this webinar, Marina and Michael will present 5 evidence-based recommendations for fact-checkers, and Luc van Bakel will complement these recommendations with practical examples. And we do this in 2 parts. First, Michael and Luc will talk about the first 2 recommendations, after which there will be room for the audience to ask questions. And in the second part, Marina and Luc will talk about recommendations 3, 4, and 5, after which there will again be room for questions from the audience. But before we start, I'd like to make a few announcements. First, if you haven't done it already, please turn off your microphones. And second, this webinar will be recorded. So if you don't want to be seen, please also turn off your camera. And finally, any questions that may arise during the webinar may be asked in the chat. So that was it for now. I would now like to give the floor to Michael Hameleers.
Yes, thanks. So before we really start going in depth with the actual recommendations, I would like to present the background and key puzzle of this webinar, but also of the white paper we've written, that you can also find on the website, of course. But the main sort of background and key puzzle that we found was that in many different research projects, also in my own work, but also in international comparative work, research has found that fact-checking is an effective tool, an effective strategy to reduce misperceptions and to fight misinformation. However, those studies are mainly based on artificial lab settings, on findings that are perhaps different from the real world. And also these studies point to different barriers to the effectiveness of fact-checking outside of the lab environment. So for example, a high-choice media environment where people can select many different sources, or the lack of attention of people to media content, or the extent to which people select information that is in line with their existing beliefs may all have important implications for the effectiveness of fact. So this raised a key question for us, where we also saw sort of the collaboration with practitioners and fact checkers that have to work in this daily environment that is quite challenging, is how can we make fact checking effective given the current information environment with different struggles, but also how can we make sure that we reach the people that need fact-checking most? How can we make sure that the implementation and the tools that we are found to be effective in different settings where people do pay attention to them, how can we make sure that people in real life also pay attention to them and are actually exposed to them after seeing misinformation? I mean, that was the main background and key puzzle of this webinar in the white paper that's also been sent in the chat. So this mainly resulted in 5 key recommendations that we would like to flesh out during this webinar. So first, what's important is that we overcome the avoidance and resistance that people may have to fact-checking as coming from sort of a more elite institution. How can we make the formats of fact-checking effective to overcome this resistance and make sure that people do select fact-checking after also seeing misinformation? One other more concrete solution is that we should avoid the repetition of false claims in the verdict and not make them more prominent than they should be, which may also enhance the effects of the misinformation, but not the correction. At the same time, we should be careful that by warning people for deceptive content, by raising cynicism perhaps towards information, at the same time, we should make sure that accurate information is still trustworthy and that people still trust the information that they can trust and that's not misinformation. And potentially connected to this is that people are also offered recommendations, tips and tricks themselves on how they can themselves navigate the information environment and potentially also themselves know why certain things are wrong or right without sort of only giving a verdict, but also helping people to navigate their own information setting. I think related to that again, the fifth recommendation is that we ideally would like to see media users being critical towards information, to sort of navigate their information environment by having moderate levels of suspicion whenever needed. However, we don't want to stimulate a too cynical attitude that would point to rejection of all information, including the information that is being presented and pushed by fact-checking initiatives. So those are the 5 key recommendations, and I will now sort of highlight the first 2 ones based on the my perspective or the academic perspective, after which Luc will talk more about how to implement them and how fact-checking in practice may respond to these recommendations. What we find in different research projects is that those people who need fact-checking most are the ones that are most vulnerable to misinformation, right? Because we want to correct the beliefs of people who are exposed to misinformation and who may believe it and are likely to accept misinformation. The problem there is that we find that if you look at sort of the biases of people's selection patterns, is that people who are most vulnerable to misinformation because of their existing beliefs, because of their agreement with these false claims, are also likely to avoid fact checks that could be perceived as an attack on their beliefs, because the fact check basically says what you have selected and what you truly believe is wrong. So in that sense, it's an attack on their beliefs, and people don't like to be challenged and don't like to be attacked. And for those people that are most vulnerable to misinformation, the fact check could be seen as an attack on their existing beliefs. Importantly, what may also relate to this is that people may perceive the platforms of fact-checking institutions as elite media that they don't sort of integrate in their typical daily media routines. So what's important there for fact-check is to be present on the same platforms as the original false claims, to make sure that you reach the people that may be most vulnerable to misinformation, to meet them where they are. And they are typically not having a very high media diet that consists of established media formats that could include fact-checking platforms. That's one of the related suggestions to that. The other is more in the stylistic elements of the actual refutation. So because people don't like to be attacked and challenged, I think it's important that we should not sort of avoid sort of the strong attack on people's beliefs by using a style that relativizes the threats, but potentially also acknowledges why people may fall for misinformation without calling them stupid, wappies in the Dutch term, or other terms that would potentially further contribute to the polarization of people that fall for misinformation. The second recommendation here is to try to make sure that false information in a fact check is not too strongly repeated. This is based on a theoretical idea that if you repeat false statements too much, it may create an illusion of truth, because when false statements are repeated, people become more familiar with them, and because they become more familiar with these false statements, they may also be more likely to accept them as trustworthy. Because when something is repeated more often, also it becomes more accessible in the mind, and therefore it may also create the idea that whatever is so prominently available, whatever is repeated so many times, must be true, because it doesn't sort of deviate from the normal situation. Therefore, a suggestion there is that without sort of course, you need to make sure what was false and what was true, but to also in the fact check emphasize what reality looks like, instead of repeating the false claims too much in the title and the body of correction. What's also important there to avoid the repetition or the centrality or the emphasis on the false information is to make a verdict and the argument for the verdict of whether something is true or false already stand out in the first part of the correction. This is also because people may not pay attention to the full fact check because people are living in an overburdened information setting where they get information from many different sources at the same time. They may decide to go to other information quite quickly. So it's also important that sort of the verdict and not just the false claims becomes very clear early on in the correction. And some initiatives that use logos or rating scales may already help to make it very clear what the verdict is. So this is all sort of from the perspective of academia and sort of the theoretical perspective on what would help to make fact checks more effective. But Luc now will go into more depth about how this works in practice and what kind of practical examples may relate to these recommendations or that can build further on these recommendations. So Luc, I give the floor to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see that we are with many people. I cannot see you, I only see a screen, but I hope it will be very interesting. And please put your questions in the chat, please. My name is Luc van Bakel. I work for the public broadcast VRT in Flanders, Belgium. And we try to implement these recommendations on a daily basis on a news floor. But there are some practical questions we can have. So I want to show you how we do it. And if you have questions, please let me know. So what are the practical questions if I hear terms like you have to present the fact checks on the same platform as the mis and the disinformation? For me, sometimes that is difficult because each news floor works on a different way. So I think everybody has to ask himself some questions on which platform do you already work on, and how do you adapt fact checks to a specific platform, because it's not that easy to translate one fact check on several social media, because each social media has its own language. Who do you target? Which is the audience you want to reach with the fact check you write? What is your budget? What is your technological knowledge? Do you have creators in the house to do this? So there are a lot of questions to implement all these academic recommendations into practice. So I can only tell, of course, what we do at VRT. First of all, we are a public broadcast. We have 5 radio channels, 2 television channels, and some different online channels. So we started 1 year ago with a big new approach of this information. That is on the next slide, please. Yes, so we did a survey with 2,000 Flemings to see where do you think that mis or disinformation is going around? Where do you see it or think you see fake news? And 96% of the Flemish people mentioned at least one channel through which they have already received false information. So that is a lot. But then if you ask on which platforms do you see that information, then you see a broad range. You see, of course, the Facebook, the TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, of course, but they also mention other news apps, television, newspapers, radio, magazine. So there are a lot of platforms in which you can bring fact checks on. So next slide. So what we do, we made a 360-degree approach, because in the same survey we asked, we could see what age are they, and we see that mis and disinformation is a problem of all ages, of all educational levels, high educated, lower educated. So the 360-degree approach means that we try to bring fact checks or items on disinformation or disinformation on as many platforms as we can manage. First of all, we made a radio show, we made a podcast for a younger audience, we make short form videos that can be easily spread and are maybe more interesting for people who do not like to read long and boring fact checks. We try to be present on different social media platforms like Instagram. We're working on a formula for TikTok and things like that. We have the classical fact check page, and we try to build a community to counter disinformation. So that is the 360 degrees approach. I will show you some examples on the next slides. This is, for example, some Instagram fact checks, not only of VRT, but for news checkers in Holland, they do it as well. So here we work with different slides, short text. It's sometimes hard to mention sources, but we mention to the main page of VRT. You have also people who are active on TikTok, which is a completely different way to work on. It's on the next slide. For example, is the channel of Marina Tulin, who works a lot on TikTok. But if you want to do Instagram and TikTok, it's a completely different approach. The one is with mostly with fixed images, short text. Then you have the video format of TikTok. So you need to have creators to do them both if you want to do them both. For VRT, we're working on a format to go on TikTok as well. But for us, it's not as easy as it looks. Next slide, please. We have also different audio and video formats which we work on. I told you we had a podcast where we bring fact checks, but the way we bring fact checks on radio is completely different than the way we bring a fact check in a written article. So one lesson from an article is look at the title, say if it's wrong or correct immediately. What you do on radio, there we put it in a little quiz formula where we ask somebody, do you think it's true or not? So it's a completely different approach to work with the same research. We make videos, short videos, and so on. Next page, please. So what about media avoidance, which is a problem, as Michael mentioned as well? Yes, what we can say for media avoidance, that is a problem, because there is maybe too much information on the internet. What we think is important to do is to vary in form of the fact check, as I told you. Maybe technology can help us in spreading the fact check a little bit better, or help us in the dictation. But for us, good old collaboration and community building is one of the most important things in combating disinformation as well. And I have an example with me on the next slide. Yeah, an example, it's the Checkers. The Checkers is an initiative. It's an independent organization. And it not only collects fact checks of different media organizations on one web page, but it also brings the fact check in social media discussions, so directly on the place where the disinformation is being spread. For example, on the right side of the screen, you see a discussion. Somebody shares an image from Ireland which says girls need to stay indoors after 6 p.m. New arrivals to this area are not accustomed to Irish cultural norms at this transitionary time. And the people who share this image tells that it's a new law by the government. No, of course it's not true, but you see Monique down the screen, she reacts terrible. What does the Checkers do? They react and they say, hi Monique, I don't think it's true. Here is a fact check on it. And Monique answers, thank you, I will spread it. And we saw that in 65% of the time that the Checkers respond on a claim directly where it was being spread, that people reacted positive. The other 35% were mostly negative, or you get a block. That happens as well. But you see, it can help, and for us that is important as well too. Next slide, please. So another thing that came out of the suggestions is the form, how to present your fact check. The suggestion was emphasize reality instead of the false claim in the title and body of correction. So for us, we have some guidelines in how we use titles in the written articles. So we choose always for a yes or no title for clear, non-polarizing claims. We seek an alternative when polarizing or sensitive topics, because for us the goal is to being read by a broad audience, not to win a discussion by a small group who claims something. So we spend a lot of attention on choosing titles. We avoid clickbait and we avoid repeating the claim as a question itself. So that's how we work on titles in classical fact checks, written fact checks. And on the next page, we have, I will tell you something about how we form this, make the verdict an argument for verdicts stand out in the first part of the correction. So I searched for different kind of fact checks. You see news checkers in Holland, they do it very clearly. They start with the claim, the judgment, and so on. Fact Check of Flanders, which is another organization, they give a short introduction in which they tell you what the exact claim is, where it is spreading, and what the answer is. DPA Fact Check more or less do the same, and for VRT we use the same technique. So we have we start with the introduction, then we have an in short piece in which we tell what is this about, what is the narrative of this fact check, why is this a story and why is it important for us, and then we say, but is it true or not? And then you get the rest of the article. Yes, and I think, are there any questions so far?
Yes, thank you very much, Michael and Luc. That was really enlightening. Now, indeed, is the time to ask questions. So please put your questions in the chat. And in the meantime, I do have a question for Michael. Michael, some people regard fact checkers as part of an untrustworthy elite. Can these people be convinced by a fact check?
Well, I'm not sure if like the most extreme distrusting group that's also a smaller group in society can always be convinced. However, I do think that some of the approaches also mentioned previously, reaching them where they are, using a tone that doesn't directly attack them, using less an elitist format presentation by sort of what the checkers can sometimes do, sort of the more personal approach could help in that sense. But I do think that for a large group of people that turn away from the media altogether, only find information from extremist or alternative source, I'm not sure if they can directly be convinced, but perhaps the target is also the bigger group in the middle that should not be ignored, that can still have doubts, sometimes also legitimate doubts, by not mocking their doubts, I think, but taking them seriously, by taking into account that some of these are justified, by acknowledging that some things are surrounded by uncertainty, and avoiding a direct attack on their beliefs. I do think that many people that are uncertain or distrusting can still be convinced and connected. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I see that we have a question from Shannon. I think it's a question for Luc. How do you avoid being polarizing while still being clear about the conclusion of the check?
That's a very good question. It's sometimes very difficult to avoid it. But for example, for us, it's not important to attack is the wrong word, but to directly say person X is wrong. It's more about what is being said, so you can turn a title differently and approach it more thematically. I think sometimes that works better, because if I can imagine if you agree with a certain claim and you see a direct attack on that claim or a direct attack on the person who spreads it, you're not interested in the fact check because you already think, it's always the same. But if you approach it on a more broader way, maybe they're going to read the article. Maybe not, but maybe they do. But it stays difficult, yes.
Thank you. We have another question from Thomas. I think it's also a question for Luc. Is it true that fact checks don't get enough attention on social media? And if yes, what's the cause?
Good question again. Is it do they not get enough attention on social media? I don't know if that is true. It's of course the misinformation is always faster and more spread than the fact check itself. But I think it's with a lot of things. But I think it's important that the silent group dares to spread fact checks as well, but that is a whole process. So I don't have a clear solution on that, no.
Michael, do you have anything to add to this question?
No, I think that's a very fair point. I think also that disinformation is often also intentionally made to make an impact, to go viral, to make use of algorithms, to emphasize the negative, emphasize the conflict, use certain emotion words. And on the other hand, it's also, there is much more misinformation than there are fact checks, right? So also the same narrative on misinformation is typically disseminated by many people clinging onto it, many strategical actors, many bots that emphasize the same claims, whereas one fact check takes way more resources to create in one single line of misinformation. So I also think in an attention economy, it's indeed the case that misinformation is an advantage over fact checks typically. What can be done about it? I'm not sure. I think you cannot, perhaps there's also something to be said about algorithms should perhaps also make fact checks of claims more visible and reduce sort of the spread worthiness of mis and disinformation. I think that's a wider discussion on their policies. And if something is flagged by Also the fact check platforms that are supported by platforms, perhaps they should also make them more prominent and give them a stronger weight in people's algorithms. So perhaps there's also something to be said about that they should perhaps be more prominent and more salient and not lose the attention economy of misinformation that doesn't have to check all the claims because it can simply spread based on what's most viral and most successful in an attention economy.
And if I may, I think it's very important to vary your form on social media as well, because a traditional fact check is a boring piece. It's mostly not very tempting to read. So maybe news companies has to experimentate more with memes or with algorithms or with more new techniques to get it more easily spread, or to work more on emotions. But that is something that is quite new for us.
Yes, thank you for your answer. I have another question for Luc from myself. We hear a lot about artificial intelligence lately. How could AI possibly influence the fact-checking process?
It can help in some sort of way for the moment. So it can help. I think artificial intelligence, it's good for detection, I think, in some sort of way. It can help in spreading the fact check, but I think to do the fact-checking work itself, it's not strong enough already. So if you see, for example, ChatGPT, if you ask for certain sources with the things the chat gives you, we noticed that ChatGPT fabricates the sources itself, so it's not reliable. So you cannot use it to do the fact-checking, but maybe it can help to build detection systems to get more easily fact checks spread on the internet. So I think it's a collaboration again between men and AI that will be the future.
Well, at least it's good news for the fact checkers who are still needed then.
I still believe that humans will be needed, yes.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I would like to give the floor to Marina for the next 3 recommendations.
Yes, thank you, Michael, and hi all. Thank you for joining today, also from my side. My name is Marina Tulin, and I will now continue talking to you about the remaining 3 recommendations that came from our literature review of the scientific literature. So the remaining recommendations are, strictly speaking, not about debunking, but they are about the broader benefits that fact-checking might have. And in line with this, the 3rd recommendation is not about debunking false information, but it is about enhancing trust in reliable information. And why is that important? Well, we just saw a slide by Luc showing that Flemish people are very concerned with this information. And that is it's not entirely surprising, but it's not in line with the amount of false information that is actually out there. So there are several studies that have looked at different platforms in different countries, and they find that misinformation is actually a marginal problem, at least in the average news diet. So they find that between 6% and 0.1% of information online is not entirely correct. So while it might sound like disinformation is all around us, it looks like that the majority of information is actually accurate. So a very strong focus on all the ways that information is wrong or deceptive might not be entirely well placed. And as we've already heard others say, there's also evidence that warning too much about misinformation might lead people to distrust not only false claims, but also, well, real news. Well, to address this, one suggestion for fact checks is to try and enhance the acceptance of reliable information. And that can look like this. Fact checks can, for example, explain why the sources that are used in debunks can be considered reliable. They can explain how evidence and expert information are created and what makes them more reliable than false claims or just opinions. And if readers are nudged towards credibility features, they are less likely to think that everything they see online is untrustworthy. And instead, they are reminded that there are trustworthy sources, and they are given some guidance as to what these trustworthy sources look like. So the next recommendation closely relates to this. In addition to showing why the provided sources in the fact check are reliable, fact checks could also help readers navigate the information environment in general. On online platforms, people tend to be bombarded with a lot of information, and it has been shown that this information overload is related to news fatigue and that it makes it harder for people to think analytically. And there's also some evidence that the major reason why people fall for false information is not that they are biased, but that they are lazy. I put it in quotation marks because that's not my words. I prefer to say that they are overwhelmed. So therefore, knowing how to navigate the information environment is one way that people can be protected from false information. And fact checks have the potential to help readers with that. For example, they can show where people can find reliable information on the issues that the fact check addresses, but also more broadly. These sources are ideally easily accessible and also easy to comprehend. And they can be from official sources, they can be in written format, but also blogs or podcasts, as long as they are based on high quality evidence. And for acceptance of these sources, it could be helpful if the sources cover different political leanings to avoid the impression that the fact checker tries to convince the reader of a specific political view. So as a concrete suggestion, then, fact checks could offer a short list of suggested further readings or additional resources at the bottom of the fact check article. And in this way, readers are not forced to consume certain kinds of sources, but they are given the choice from a list of sources that are considered trustworthy. And the hope is that this can provide some guidance on how to navigate the information environment that is overburdened, while actually staying informed by trustworthy sources. And finally, the fifth recommendation is to stimulate media literacy skills. And here the idea is, and we've again heard this already, is that it's hard for fact checkers to keep up with the constant flow of false information. And that's for different reasons. One is fact checks are reactive. So there's first some false claims and then the fact check comes after. And second, it takes a lot of time and effort to create fact checks. And that's simply an unfair battle because it's very easy to put out a false claim, but it's relatively hard to correct it. And unexpectedly, it has been shown that misinformation can spread wider and faster than the fact checks that aim to correct it. So what can fact checkers do? Well, if it's the case that they cannot keep up with correcting all instances of false information, another way forward is to empower average citizens and readers to become more resilient to misinformation. And that really matters because users of online platforms are not just passive consumers. They also share content, they engage with it, and in this way, maybe unknowingly, they help misinformation spread online. So that also means that average citizens have a role to play in reducing false information. So how can they be empowered to do so? Well, some research has already experimented with this, and I'm sure we're going to hear from Luc about some practice examples as well. But in the scientific study, a fact check was combined with a media literacy message, and that message included recommendations such as check the sources, check the facts, or check the argumentation of a false claim. And the result was that a combination of a fact check and a media literacy message was more effective than either a fact check or the message alone. So our final suggestion for fact checkers is to provide tips and tricks on how users themselves can spot false claims. And this is about it for our story on the scientific evidence. For now, I would like to give the floor back to Luc, who's going to tell us a little bit more about how these suggestions can be put in practice.
Hello. In general, for me, recommendations 3, 4, and 5 have to do with media literacy and the technology gap in a society. So what I think is the most interesting to implement on the news floor is the combination of the debunk and the media literacy as the most effective way to bring information to a broad public. So what are the key items we work on with VRT is the transparency, of course, giving the sources where you can find the information, to share tips and tricks on how you do it yourself, the fact checking. We have an educational program for schools also worked out. I will tell you more about this in a couple of minutes. We have fact check videos in which we try to learn audiences how to do some things themselves. And we have an intern checking program for all journalists and workers within VRT to get more used with the techniques that fact checkers use as well. So that's in short what we do. On the next slide, I will show you some examples of that. For examples, we make a weekly video on how to do something that has to do with fact checking. Here you see 3 examples. How can you determine when a picture was taken? And we give some fact checking tips on how you do it. How do you fact check a video? How do you recognize photos being made by AI, as far as it's still, if you still can notice it. So each week we bring another video. These videos are being spread on social media, being posted on the homepage of our news website, and we attach them on every check that we publish as well, to give in each fact check one media literacy or one fact check tip you can use yourself. So a fact check is built up always in this with the same procedure. We always try to write down how we did the research ourselves. So we think that is very important. That is what the fact checkers concern. But we have other things that we with our team, we're a team of 6 fact checkers. 7 fact checkers. We also go to schools to give introductions in fact checking, and we made an educational program, which you will probably see on the next slide. It is called the Edu Box. We did that together with the academic field in Flanders. We developed an educational program which schools and teachers can download themselves, because we believe that the disbelief in classical media, the diminishing of media trust, it's not a problem that we as a fact checker or a disinformation desk can solve. It's something you have to do with the academic field, with education. It's a much wider problem than only the fact checking or to debunk some disinformation. I think fact checking itself is just one tool out of a big toolbox you can use in fighting disinformation or fighting that media literacy gap there is. So this is a program. What can schools do? They can download it. It's for free, and it's a whole lesson packet, I think, of a couple of hours with videos, practices, and so on. Schools can use, and we do that on different topics. For example, we do that on internet scams as well, internet security, cyber security, how to go safe on the internet, how can you recognize fake news. So it's a package we want to deliver to schools or to organizations that can work on it. That is as well a very important thing we do as a fact-checking team. And on the next slide, please. We see that a lot of organizations, one I think is a very good example of it, are the people of News Checkers. They have a page with check tips in which they get articles and videos on how to do or how did we some research on it. I think for a media organization nowadays, it's very important to show how you do your research, how you write an article in general, not only fact checks, how you get your information. So the transparency and the how-to factor is growingly important for a classical news media, not only for fact-check media, but for a classical media organization, because that is what makes the difference between alternative media who doesn't care about facts or the news media who wants to bring serious and checked news. So the how-to, it involves it grows faith in your in your media as well. So very important for us. Next slide, please. So that was it, the practical. If there are any questions about recommendations 3, 4, and 5, or about certain media examples, please let us know.
Yes, thank you very much, Marina and Luc. That was again really interesting. And indeed, if there are any questions, let us know via the chat. In the meantime, I do have a question for Marina. Marina, you said in your 5th recommendation that we should stimulate media literacy, but how can we stimulate critical thinking without making people distrustful?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I just want to say I very much support what Luc said, that fact checkers can only do this much. I mean, today we are talking about the role of fact checkers, so it might look like we assign the responsibility of educating the public to fact checkers, but it's simply because of the nature and topic of this webinar. Well, I think, yeah, a collaboration will be very important. Fact checkers are at the forefront of understanding new techniques to manipulate information. They might be the first ones to understand innovations pretty much in how information can be made deceptive. And it might be the case that their responsibility for educating the public directly ends there, so that those insights can be used by educators or media literacy experts who work out the exact techniques and trainings that are necessary.
Luc, do you have anything to add to this point?
No, I think it's good to know that it's not only the fact checker's responsibility to avoid this whole problem. So I think it's a responsibility for the whole media sector, because we did an investigation on trust in media inside VRT, and what we saw was media that sometimes do fact checks, media that have some kind of history, media that work transparently are more being trusted than media who don't do that. So it's very important as a company or as a media, not only for fact checking, but to work on transparency. What are your sources? Why do you bring a certain story? What is the bigger narrative in a story? To always emphasize these things as well. But it's not only something a fact checker unit has to do, but it's what the classical media has to do in general, I think.
Okay, thank you. In the meantime, we got a question from Florin to Luc. Luc, how do fact checkers get financed? And is there an imbalance between the financial power of fact checkers and the financial power of other sources of information? And if so, what effects?
How do we get paid? I can only speak for VRT, of course, because there is not something as the fact checker is being paid by X or I. It's of course every unit of every media company has to arrange his own financial responsibility. For us, we're a public broadcast, so I can only talk for us. We get 60% paid by the government. So because we are a public broadcast with different television channels and different radio stations, we are not have any agreements with social media, for example. Other companies do have agreements with social media companies to combat disinformation on the social media platform itself. For example, I know there are some collaborations with Facebook or TikTok. That is something we don't do, but that is for every fact-checking organization his own responsibility to see how things getting paid.
Yes, thank you. And another question for you from our own Michael Hameleers. He asks, how do you motivate lazy people, between quotation marks, to engage in the tips and tricks that may seem as an additional task? So how do you make sure that people read your check tips?
That is a very good question, which we ask ourselves every day. How can we get a bigger audience? We are lucky because we already have several stations or several platforms that we can work on. So by that we reach a very big audience, also with youth people. But if we want to try or reach people who have a disbelief in media, that is for us as well very difficult. We have problems in reaching different different cultures, we have problems in reaching very young people. And that's what we try to work on every day. And for us, it's very important to experimentate with the form of the news that we want to bring. How do you translate an article, or how do you translate science for TikTok? That is not that easy. How do you translate something on Instagram? How can you reach some kind of people and still go outside as one brand? In our case, it's VRT. So we're working on that on a daily basis, into vary the form, vary the formule in which we tell something as much as we can, and to adapt it to age, to educational level, and to all kind of things that we can adapt in.
Okay, thank you. And question for Marina. Which transparency ingredients are there besides adding sources to your fact check?
I think that might actually be a question to Luc, but the ones that I know of are any of the journalistic standards that I think fact checkers hold themselves to, right? So not only be transparent about the sources, but also how the fact check came about. Maybe Luc should answer this. Actually, I think I think this is directed to the practice of fact checking, right?
Can you repeat the question once more, please?
Yes, which transparency ingredients are there besides adding the sources to fact checks? So how do you make your fact check transparent?
Yeah, so the first of all, the sources, as you already mentioned, what we do as well is you always can ask us questions. We have a direct tab to ask questions if you think something is wrong or you have questions on a certain topic. The way we are financed is published on our page. Who writes the articles and the background of the people who write the articles is published on our page. So all sorts of information that we think can help the transparency and the communication with the audience are directly published on the fact-checking page. So everybody who has answers, how do we judge a claim, what are the kinds of topics that we fact check, who writes the fact check and what is his background, what are our cooperations with other media or with some sorts of organizations in the field, how do we get financial support of some sort way. It's always being published on that page to being as transparent as possible. That is for us as well quite important. That is one, you have some international labels. I think everybody knows, for example, the IFCN, the International Fact-Checking Network. If you want to be a member of that, you have to be transparent in your sources, finances, and the way you work. And you have to have a correction policy as well. So you have to show if somebody remarks something in your work that he or she thinks is not quite correct, and we have to agree, because we are humans as well, maybe we can do this better. We have to put it with the date and the remark itself on the website as well. So it's a kind of policy on transparency and a correction policy that we have.
Does that happen often that you get corrected?
No, because we try to work, we try to deliver good work, but it happens, yes. Or it happens a lot that people have questions with sources that we use, and then we try to answer them by mail and directly and in a personal way, why we choose for the source that we have used.
Okay, thank you. Another question for you, Luc. Do you think that creating communities around fact-checking, such as the ones that you mentioned, can make people feel more responsible for unmasking fakes, and maybe even contribute to a more positive attitude towards fact-checking?
I hope so, but it's very difficult to start a community because there's if you see all the comment on social media, I think only 10% is producing that content, and there is 90% that is only reading the content. So I think it's not that easy. I hope it can help, but I also think it's sometimes difficult because it's if, for example, if you take Twitter, there's a lot of there's a lot of violence in words on that channel, so it's not that easy to speak out. But it would be nice if more people would share a fact check or would share the right information, or gently correct this information, because just by putting under some fake photo or a fake article, I think this is not real. What is your source, for example? Always stay gentle and polite. I think just that can help a lot, because everybody reads the comments on social media, and if you see from maybe there are some questions with that photo or that article, you start thinking, and maybe you go searching on Google for another other article on that, so it can help always. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another question for you, Marina. It's from myself. You said that it's almost impossible for fact checkers to keep up with the flow of false information. And I was wondering if we shouldn't focus more on pre-bunking instead of debunking then.
Yeah, thank you. So the idea of pre-bunking is a good one. So the idea is that before a false claim has a chance to settle into people's memories, and before it has a chance to attach to all kinds of emotions or worldview, we already disarm it. In practice, there's at least two challenges, I think. The first one is it might be hard to predict what the next false claim is going to be before it's already widely spread. This might be possible in the future. Well, we see already, for example, the EDMO, the European Digital Media Observatory, started publishing early warnings. So to make our correction efforts not reactive, we need to know what is going to come next. And I think we're not that good at that yet. There's efforts towards that, but I think it's hard to predict. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the pre-bunking literature is a bit mixed and inconclusive. So we see, for example, that there are these disinformation games that teach different techniques that can be used, and supposedly they prepare people for future misinformation attacks, and then they are better prepared. People are better prepared. These don't seem to replicate outside of Western countries. And also pre-bunking, more than debunking, runs the risk of undermining trust. So taking all that together, I would say debunking is still a safer option at this point because we know too little about pre-bunking.
And what about a combination between pre-bunking and debunking?
That's a good question. I would suspect that it doesn't solve the problem of undermining trust. If you first say, you're going to be deceived, and then you say, oh, look at that, you have been deceived. I don't think it solves the trust issue. But yeah, we have to weigh the pros and cons of these different techniques.
Okay, right, thank you. I see that there are no more questions, so then I think it's time to wrap it up. We're nice on time. Thank you all for participating in this webinar, and a special thanks to Michael, Luc and Marina for presenting. If you want to know more about our project, you can visit benedmo.eu or follow us on social media. And for now, I would like to wish you all a very nice afternoon, and I hope to see you again sometime.